today I have a story about a queen. And as I was preparing the sermon, I had to get a giggle. I said, here I am speaking to an audience about a story about a queen. And I'm sure they're all saying to themselves, have I got a story about a queen? But, of course, we're talking about Queen Esther, and we're solidly in the book of Esther for today's sermon. And actually, we would normally have Wesley come up and do the reading. However, what I wanted to do was give you a little bit of a background before he just slides right in there and starts reading, and you're going, wait a minute, who, what, when, where? So what we're talking about in our sermon today is going to be Queen Esther in Persia, and at a particular time, and what I'm going to do is point out right in this area here on the timeline. Over here is around 607 BC, and that's when the temple was first destroyed in Jerusalem, and everybody went into Babylonian captivity. And then along the line here, where we get into where it says Xerxes, and there'll be another name for this guy in the reading. What happened was Darius was the king of Persia, and he defeated the Babylonians and released the Jews to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So we're in that area where some of the Jews have gone back to Israel. They were given the option, go back if you'd like. There were a lot of them who said, nah, you know what? I've been to Jerusalem. I've seen what the Babylonians did, and there's just too much work to put the place back together. So many Jews just never returned to Jerusalem. They stayed within that area of what is now Iran. It was originally known as Persia. And we'll talk about the leadership and the people involved in a minute. So just know that there's a lot of Jews that didn't return. They're staying in the Persian area. And with our story, there's a lot that goes into it. And we're just going to have a little small piece of it here today. So we're in the area of about 500 to 480 BC in Persia, and as far as our characters, I've got some paintings that we can share with you along with their names. First is Esther. That's the queen that we're talking about here today. She was actually Jewish, and her name in Israel was Hadassah. And she was noted for being very lovely, very smart, but she also lost her parents when she was young. And she was then adopted by her uncle, Mordecai, and he became kind of a quasi-figure for her. And they both were living in this area of Persia. And Mordecai was a pretty smart guy, and he was able to, like Joseph in Egypt, become indispensable to the ruling elite. So he was in, if you will, in cahoots with the king of Persia in assisting the king with running the palace. Now, the king at the time, you'll notice, is referred to as King Xerxes. In our reading, he's got another name. He's also known as Ahasuerus, and I know I messed that up. And this is a relief of Xerxes found in Persia, in the National Museum Iran. Then we have a guy called Haman. And let me back up. The king of Persia was noted for being like most kings of his time and politicians today who are filled up with all of their importance. He loved to drink. He loved his women. He had several women, but only one queen. The women were kind of like the harem, and the favorite ended up being the queen. So we'll be getting to how Esther got there in a little bit. Now, Haman was the weasel in the power structure. He was always conniving. He had some power, but he wanted more power, and he wanted to be shown respect and people to bow down to him and kneel when he came by, kind of like royalty in England these days. Then we have a lady called Vashti. Vashti was the original queen. She was favored by the king of Persia. She was lovely, very pretty, and when there were big parties at the palace, the king, being oh so bombastic and verbose, just pulls out all of his women and then sends for Vashti to come out and parade in front of all of his friends so that they could see the beauty of his chosen queen. Well, one thing you got to know about kings in that time that were filled with themselves, if you didn't behave properly, you could find yourself headless very quickly. And if you didn't follow the proper protocol, you could find yourself in some deep trouble. So when Vashti said, "No, I'm not coming, my hair's not done," or whatever the excuse was, according to the scripture, she was banished. She could never come into the sight of the king ever again. And that's all we ever hear of Vashti ever again. So I'm kind of thinking it's probably kind of like something happened out with the mob in Las Vegas, out in the desert, and you're buried alone. It's probably more what happened with Vashti. So there was a vacancy, if you will, in the palace for a queen. And that's where smart Mordecai gets hold of Esther and says, "You need to apply for the job." And what we're told about Esther is she was a pretty good looking woman. She was quite sensual, and she pleased the king. So he made her his queen to replace Vashti. And not so much in what you see in the reading today, but what happened was Mordecai came into the palace, and he then ran into Haman, the weasel, and didn't show the proper respect. So Haman goes to the king and says, "Hey, listen, this guy Mordecai, he's a Jew, and the Jews are plotting against you, and we need to get rid of them. And this is where we're setting up for what happens with our reading here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Wesley to do the reading, and then we'll pick up the story in a minute.
And we are, from the book of Esther. So the king and Haman went into feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition?" Queen Esther, "It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very pole that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that pole." So they hung Haman on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor.
So this was the culmination of a lot of underhanded work by Haman, and actually it doesn't fill in all of the goings on, because the Jews, after this proclamation had been made and the king had pulled it back, according to the Persian laws at that time, the people could still, on this particular day of Purim, they could still go out and attack Jews. But the Jews were made aware of the plan, and the king also said, "You have the right to defend yourself." So there was a little skirmish, and about 500 Persians were actually killed by Jews who were trying to come against them and do them bodily harm. So for this reason, in the Jewish faith today, there is a celebration of deliverance that the Jews established as the Feast of Purim, and it's a joyous holiday commemorating Esther's courage and the defeat of Haman. And the book of Esther is always read during the Feast of Purim, and the story of Esther's heroism is told year after year by the Jews. The Feast of Purim continues to be celebrated by Jewish communities worldwide, serving as an enduring legacy to what Esther did, because I'll back up and ask you to remember that I said there was a certain protocol in the king's court. And even if the king or if the queen, as we saw with Vashti, if she angers the king by her request, she's out in the desert with Vashti also. So in our story, there's wisdom to listen to the problem, and there's courage to present it to the king. So it's wisdom and courage that we're really looking at here as it's key to what we're talking about, because what happens when we start talking about Esther, early on there's something that's quoted by a lot of theologians when it refers to Esther, and I don't want you to start thinking that we're drawing any conclusions to politics here today when I say that we have a woman who is looking to save a people who could potentially tick off the king and be banished, or even worse. And her cousin Mordecai, early on, to help encourage this courageous queen, said something to the effect of, "You're chosen for times such as these," kind of giving the air of she has been given divine providence, if you will. So she was encouraged to, as one of our politicians today says, do something. So she was encouraged to take courage and go forth and talk to the king. And a lot of theologians will use this particular phrase, and I've got it right here. Perhaps you have come to such as a time as this, and that's in Esther 4:14, and it's part of what's known as common wisdom, and it's tied in with Ecclesiastes and the Book of Ruth and things like this. So we humans tend to like this so-called wisdom because it makes us feel that we can easily validate our plans with some sort of a divine endorsement on pursuing them. But that's not what the passage is talking about this week, and it's not what the book of Esther teaches us about divine providence. Mordecai's words actually happened like 3 chapters before what we read today. So we need to consider how Esther's story illustrates that how wisdom calls us to do something, to act with courage, to demand justice, to advocate for accountability. And you might want to ask yourselves, where in our neighborhood do you need courageous voices to speak? Where do your neighbors need the church to show up and demand justice? Wisdom persistently knocks at our door with these questions and more. Our question might be, how can we enliven these questions within our circles of influence? A point of today's reading that we're talking about is that actual moment where Esther begs deliverance from the king. The moment the king grants that deliverance, and very importantly, the moment in which the people of the Jewish faith inaugurate a festival to commemorate that deliverance. Now, you've heard a little bit about the book of Esther, and I would encourage you to go home and just do a quick reading of the book. It's a very small book. The basic story, a quick cover-to-cover read, will examine how the plot and the conflict of the story develop And this week's lesson presents only the resolutions. So there's a lot that was underlying it, which is why I wanted to give you the where are we, when is it, and who's involved here. Now, we learned from Esther's uncommon wisdom demands reflection and action. It's like the Apostle Paul, Augustine of Hippo, Basil of Caesarea, and many others remind us we can't be blamed for our feelings, but what we can do with those feelings does matter. In this week's lesson, we see two important responsive acts. King Ahasuerus shows mercy in response to Esther's plea, and future Jews show gratitude in response. Now, I can't think of any two character traits that are more uncommon in today's world than these. Who really shows mercy these days? Who really shows gratitude? If I lend my neighbor some money, the common wisdom of postmodern America says that I ought to profit by charging her interest and demanding that she pay me promptly in full. But if she falls on hard times, that's just too bad. We still want our money. Who out there is encouraging me and you to show mercy? The same for gratitude. Who encourages us to show gratitude? We do a really dismal job in today's economy for accounting for gifts. If you're looking for practices that express the uncommon wisdom of both the merciful King and the grateful Jews, I would submit that we turn our attention to Holy Communion. It's a perfect candidate. Many of our communion prayers include supplications for mercy. And also, we ask for grace. And we know that God will be merciful to us. When it comes to the great Thanksgiving that we talk about at communion, it's important to notice how we are invited to remember all the times that God has saved us. I think that's part of maturity. We only become mature because God has helped us survive all the stupidity of our younger years. And now we're hopefully older and hopefully wiser. Although some people I've met, I wonder. If we are people truly formed by Holy Communion, we can tell and retell these stories and our own stories because we acknowledge that we didn't earn or deserve any of this grace. Even better, just like the Jews who were spared celebrated their festival with generosity to the poor, our prayer after receiving compels us to go into the world to give ourselves to others in the faithfulness of its practice that Holy Communion invites us to live with uncommon wisdom. So today, we're being called to stop, to listen, to practice wisdom, to demand justice, and to do something. Thank you. Amen. In preparation for communion,